The House of Representatives votes 427-1 to order the Department of Justice to release its files on the investigations and prosecutions of deceased sex offender Jeffrey Epstein after months of political wrangling. What's likely to be released as part of those files, and what are some of the risks of putting all those details out there?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel, and coming to us this week to talk about the Epstein files saga, a former DOJ official who spent 27 years as a prosecutor, one-time attorney for Donald Trump, and now a partner at IFRA Law, Jim Trusty. Jim, I always learn so much from your appearances on Fox News program, the Journal editorial report we have it, and I'm so grateful you have agreed to come and similarly enlighten us here on the podcast. Thanks for coming in.
Oh, happy to join.
So just to start with, this was a pretty huge House vote, much different than just a few days ago when only a few Republicans said that they were going to force it. Did that surprise you at all?
Well, I guess it didn't surprise me once President Trump pivoted, right? You heard President Trump say now, whether it was a kind of reluctant concession or a really Machiavellian smart move, he said, go ahead, let's see what's in there. And that made it very easy. There might have been some internal momentum anyway to kind of handicap the politics, but it certainly made it easy for every Republican but one to go along with the disclosure plan.
Well, and I think now we can assume that pressure will probably inspire it to pass the Senate as well. The president has said he will sign it as part of his no big deal approach to this at the moment. Before anything else, though, I just want to step back here. There's been so much attention on the fight over releasing these files. And I wonder if it isn't worth considering again, why do we want them released beyond pure public fascination? And the answer to that among some quarters, supposedly, is that this is necessary for transparency and accountability, that maybe somehow based on this theory, we as yet don't know the whole range of co-conspirators who may have been protected by their status or their political position. And that's why I wanted to ask you, based on your long time as a prosecutor, knowing that there's been two primary federal investigations into Epstein's sex trafficking activities, how likely is it that this is the case, that there are prominent individuals out there who have escaped justice and that these files will clearly point a finger at?
Yeah, well, the second part of that's harder than the first. I mean, there's certainly been, long-standing rumors of high-profile people, politicians, captains of industry that are on flight logs, that have been friends with Epstein. I mean, all of that's there. But I have to tell you, I may be a little bit of a contrarian. I might have been the second vote in the House because as a former prosecutor, I'm used to the concept that we protect an awful lot from public scrutiny, that when prosecutors are going to bring a case, they bring the case in court and it withstands that spotlight of cross-examination, of formal accusation, of regular process. And so this whole notion that we should just be opening up prosecutor files because we all have this insane, intense interest in finding out, is there a foreign prince? Is there a former president? I mean, what's lacking, or at least what gets maybe lip service only, is the notion of we care about the victims. And I think that's the most kind of, that leaves me the most jaded here, is that you now have people saying, oh, we owe it to the victims, as if they're not being politically motivated. There's a lot of political motivations here. There's a lot that's probably still going to be murky, and you're still going to have conspiracy theories no matter how many pieces of paper are turned over. I think there's kind of, to get real direct, I think there's probably two flashpoints of the House announcement that would be of interest. One is the internal documentation. Again, stuff that as a prosecutor, you're kind of allergic to having it go public. But the internal communications about whether to charge or not could be very fascinating to shed light on who's pushing what. Why was there such a soft diversionary agreement in South Florida years ago by the feds? That stuff, I think, has some kind of institutional historical interest. And then the other thing, frankly, is whether there are aspects of the case file that may have explained the kind of false start of the Department of Justice in saying we're going to release everything and then suddenly, no, we're not. And what I mean specifically is there's a lot of rumbling that I've seen over the years to suggest that the guy wired up his house, that he's going to have a lot of videotape and audio tape. And, and maybe there's more to it. Maybe it's about compromising high profile figures by knowing that you can always have the goods on them. That kind of extortionate aspect of it, I'd like to have that put to rest either way. Either that there are tapes in existence that politicians and others had to be afraid of, or that was just an urban myth. I think those are interesting points. But again, my starting point is to be very protective, because the reason we don't do this normally, the reason we don't have prosecutor files opened up for everyone and their mother to look through, is because it jeopardizes so many things. It jeopardizes, obviously, victims. It jeopardizes the reputations of people who are not charged and will not have an opportunity to clear themselves. It may compromise manner and means of law enforcement, different types of techniques that were used. And yes, you're allowed to do redactions under this plan, but sometimes, a redaction doesn't do a whole lot. Like when you say a former president who was on the flight log, well, I think we might figure that one out. So I have a lot of concerns about how this thing is really going to play out. I have a lot of concerns about the motivations, and it all stems from 27 years of knowing as a prosecutor that you don't want to falsely impugn people or hurt the reputations of witnesses, potential defendants, and victims alike.
Yeah, can you meditate on that just for 1 minute longer? Because I am with you. I am very skeptical of this. It feels a little bit right now like there's a lot of political agenda, as you noted, that's behind this. But then from a kind of public pushing for this too, it almost feels in a small way as if there's a bunch of people in the nation that are demanding that the government give them a new episode of National Enquirer. There's just a kind of prurient interest in this. And on the meditation point, it's something that's always bothered me. When people hear the word prosecutor, understandably, they assume that the only job of a prosecutor is to prosecute, to go after people. And of course, as you would well know, and my understanding has always been, the DOJ and FBI at any one point, they have hundreds, maybe thousands of investigations going at a time, at prosecutors working to see if they have a case. But the prosecutor's actual job is to make sure justice is done. And while sometimes that involves prosecutions, isn't it as equally high a priority to make sure that those who have not done anything wrong do not lose their reputations, are not innocently besmirched?
Well, what a horribly naive concept you just raised. No, I'm really with you. I mean, my first boss as a prosecutor, when I was a local prosecutor in Maryland, he and I couldn't be more different politically, right? I mean, he had just very grandiose kind of progressive notions, not George Soros progressive, but interesting notions about what prosecutors should do. And some of that I had to just kind of swallow hard and say, man, that's too much. But the one thing he really impressed upon me and everyone from that generation that worked in that office was prosecutors have to wield power with grace. And that has always stuck with me, that as a prosecutor, you have much more power over a life than you think you do. You have the ability to accuse people, sometimes to end up indicting them, and to put their lives in a ringer. People lose their lives, lose their marriages, lose their businesses, their homes, their families. There are devastating collateral effects, and maybe sometimes that's totally earned, but there's a lot of side effects to being under the gun, being investigated by prosecutors. And so it is important that we don't have target first, evidence later, like we've seen in recent years, or innovative types of use of the law where you don't even know what the crime is until closing argument. There's a lot of things that have gone terribly wrong that you can pin in the area of prosecution, that you can say prosecutors no longer have a white hat because they've let themselves be politicized. And so consistent with that, to meditate on your point, I think a real prosecutor will tell you, a career prosecutor that's doing it right, I think, will tell you that some of the cases they're proud of are ones where they walked away, where they dropped the charges on somebody because they had a reasonable doubt whether the person committed a crime. And yeah, that's not as sensational. That doesn't get you on TV. But those are the types of moments where you're following your conscience and doing the right thing. And the precedent that's associated with what we're going through right now of having essentially social media driven outrage and prurient interest, as you've said, because of some high profile names, all of that's combining to set up a precedent where we might normalize the idea of opening up prosecutor files so all of us can have an opinion on X. And I think that's just a terrible idea institutionally, and it's a terrible idea for how prosecutors are going to conduct themselves. Are they going to be worried about the ultimate scrutiny of their file to the point where they either sanitize things or make
Oh,
decisions based on kind of the public outcome rather than what's
ooh.
actually, helping them and inform their conscience and make the right decision?
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. In your time, actually, this is a good question. Have you ever seen another situation like this where Congress intervened to require the Justice Department to divulge the contents of a closed criminal investigation? I'm not talking about special counsels here or anything, but like an actual criminal FBI DOJ investigation.
Yeah, it's not leaping to mind. The only thing I can think of is you might have had some historical moments of opening files because of either assassinations or
Right.
espionage cases. Because Congress has the oversight ability. Unfortunately, in today's world, oversight means they immediately leak everything. I think historically, if you were looking into, trading nuclear secrets with the Russians during the Cold War, that there might have been some internal scrutiny, some skiff meetings between law enforcement and Congress, but at the end of the day, you didn't have it all splashed over social media for the rest of time. So I do think we're in a different scope of disclosure than we might have had historically in a few kind of historical moments, such as, like I said, either commissions dealing with presidential assassinations or high profile politicians or just espionage cases. And I don't have a specific example in mind, but they leap to the possibility of being ones where we would have seen a court order or a Congress ordered disclosure.
The thing is we've actually seen thousands of pages now of Epstein related material, a bunch of which has been turned over by DOJ to the House Oversight Committee, which is conducting a probe. What hasn't been released is presumably some of the most sensitive stuff. And, as a prosecutor, you mentioned a couple of examples of things we might end up seeing. For instance, the communications internally about decisions and charging and that very first prosecution. But give us an idea of what else likely remains in that file and what types of information might end up getting released if this goes forward.
Right. Well, again, starting point is we don't know what we don't know. So whether there are recordings, videos, recordings of victim statements, there's a lot of things that we just don't know if they exist from the outset. What we do know generally will exist are going to be witness statements, interviews that some not in grand jury, some perhaps in grand jury, which also normally gives a level of secrecy that wouldn't allow itself to be disclosed. I think you're going to see notes from prosecutors. Each prosecutor has kind of a different practice of how much they reduce the writing, but a lot of prosecutors want to have kind of a scrolling diary of what are they doing on this case, what's their to-do list, who are they talking to, notes from communications with people within law enforcement. And so you could definitely see, really over the time period we're talking about, numerous examples of meetings between law enforcement officials, notes that relate to that. And those can be very, titillating things. They can be very interesting. They could suggest, obstructionist conduct on some people's behalf or collusion in ways that we're not really, expecting. But I think that's the main category. There's also going to be just good old fashioned FBI reportage, 302s or what they call their reports, maybe some search warrants that were executed that were relevant to the investigation. Like could be search warrants, not just for homes, but for social media accounts, emails, text messages, raw data that comes in from that type of investigation.
Mm.
So we might see a lot of internal communications between law enforcement and then a lot of communications that were gathered that relate to Epstein and Miss Maxwell and anybody else that has a piece of this puzzle.
I was actually reading, and it's actually kind of astounding because it gives a sense of just how large this investigation is. But apparently, the government still holds about 300 gigabytes of data, not to mention many pieces of physical evidence, computers, hard drives, cell phones, memory sticks. The other thing that we don't really know about is apparently there's a volume of images that include pornographic images. I'm not quite sure what the government does with that. It would seem inappropriate to release something like that. Um, Are there some things that DOJ can't release? And I was curious about this because I actually don't know the procedure here. The DOJ can't release without other authority, like sealed grand jury testimony. I know that DOJ had gone to a judge a couple of times asking for sign off to release some of this and was denied. I don't really know how much of that was politics or what was exactly going on, but can they release everything?
Yeah, it's a great question because this is what's called Rule 6E, Rule of Criminal Procedure 6E, which is a statutory granting of sealing of secrecy to grand jury proceedings. So whenever a prosecutor brings a witness in the grand jury, that's going to lead to a transcript of that testimony. That transcript is firmly covered by Rule 6E, where a prosecutor has to even get permission to turn it over to the defense if you're going to trial. Okay. Now, there are times where there's information in those interviews that's exculpatory, so it's easy. You say, Judge, I have an obligation to turn over exculpatory information. I've got to give this over. Other times it's a prior statement of a witness who's going to testify. It's another reason you turn it over. So routinely in the context of trial, Rule 6E material gets turned over. It's by far not the entirety of the prosecution file. And if a prosecutor, let's say they bring in Kim and say, let's talk, and you give an interview, and then a week later we say, let's put her in grand jury. Well, that interview from the first week is not covered by Rule 6E. So I would absolutely be in a position to turn that over without any judge getting involved. But even with that, and even if they're different or pretty much exactly the same, I'd have to sit on that statement to the grand jury until I get a permission slip. So that's an area that's typically given a lot of protection. I think the reality is when you have a congressional action demanding as part of a bill that it get turned over or disclosed to everybody, it's unlikely anyone's going to actually fight that in court. So whatever the reach of Rule 6E, I don't think we're going to see that play out. I think they're going to say, this is cover enough. We're not violating the rule of procedure. I would also just note this bill that's being taken over to the Senate now specifically allows the government to exclude certain things such as pornographic images, abusive images, violent images. All they have to do is essentially black that out and say, we're not turning it over because it constitutes whatever, sexual abuse materials or graphic violent materials, or things like personal identifying information. So they do give them some carve outs. What they don't give them is a carve out for Rule 6E, but they do give them a carve out for things that are kind of sensational or extremely embarrassing to victims. They also make it very clear you're not going to use this for high profile targets of the investigation. So they're telling the people at DOJ, you're going to turn over everything about every name we've ever heard, but you can protect victims and you can protect us from things that might be a crime to even possess, like pornographic images of an underage person.
Well, let me ask you, so the latest theory going around, mostly Democrats are fomenting this, is one other carve out that the House bill gives says that the DOJ does not have to release information that would undermine any ongoing investigation. And there is some suspicion Donald Trump obviously directed this weekend for the Justice Department to look into some prominent Democrats who are connected with Epstein. Do you think, I mean, the Democrats are suggesting this is going to be yet another way DOJ tries to not turn over everything? That doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, because I think that one of the reasons Donald Trump decided that he was going to put himself behind this, and he actually said as much, is let's throw it all out there. There's some Democrats that'll be sorry as well, too. I guess I'm asking, do you really think DOJ is going to try to continue sitting on some of this in the basis of that they can't release it because they're investigating?
Yeah, I tend to think not. I mean, the one thing I would probably do to give you a totally complete answer is roll through the code, the U.S. code, and figure out statute of limitations issues. A lot of this stuff might be prohibited by the statute of limitations, so there's no point in pretending you're starting up an investigation if you only had a 3-year or 5-year statute, which in a lot of instances it might be. But I mean, look, I'd say a couple things to this. I mean, number one, maybe it's just me. Epstein fatigue is a real thing. I'm at a point where
I'm there.
I mean, I'm at a point where it's like, do I really have to keep hearing about this? Because it just feels like it's entirely politically driven. It'd be one thing if there was a genuine concern, like we have to do this for the victims. There's still a chance to seek justice. This is about putting names out there and embarrassing people that will never have an opportunity to clear themselves. And I may not be very instinctively sympathetic to some of the men that went to Orgy Island, but at the same time, like, they are getting no ability to defend themselves, and that's one of the
Yeah.
reasons why we typically don't open up prosecutor cases that are gone. The other thing is, I have to think, and what I saw firsthand in terms of weaponization of DOJ, that if there was a smoking gun that made Donald Trump into a pedophile or some form of pervert, we would have long ago heard that. That would have been leaked out 7 days a week for about 8 years, and there'd be no mystery at all that he's part of this file. So, I do think there's room to criticize the way the administration handled this, in terms of kind of announcing it's all coming and then changing their mind. But I don't think that's I'd be surprised if it translates into something that's new and substantive and damning for the guy who literally kicked Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah, by the way, I could not agree with you more on this. I mean, the Joe Biden Department of Justice was in possession of all of this information for 4 years. They clearly weren't reluctant to use the DOJ against Donald Trump. It would have been no big thing to have leaked something if it was there. And the fact that the best we got from Democrats from these 3 emails last week was random Epstein musings about Trump and nothing more suggests that there really isn't any there, which does kind of beg the weird question of why Trump fought this for so long. But that's another issue. Another question, you, Jim Trusty, let's imagine that you're not a prosecutor anymore, and for your sins, somebody actually put you in the Senate.
This is the most hostile question I've ever faced, but go ahead.
Badgering the witness. But if you were in the Senate and you were looking at this bill, are there some additional protections you would add, whether it be for victims or some other category of information that you really felt was so much more important than everything else that it not be revealed, in part because of what you were saying about the precedent here and the concern that prosecutors might end up changing their behavior?
Well, I would turn to my fellow new Senator Jasmine Crockett, and I would say, because clearly the world's upside down at this point. Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I haven't really looked at it with an eye towards that. I would have the concerns about the grand jury, the Rule 6E. I might suggest that, absent some other justification, that should remain secret at this time. You could do this in stages. You could probably come up with a way to, but again, I don't know that there's any great interest in dragging this out. I think I'd still be the contrarian on a very fundamental level. And what I would suggest is, like, anytime we have something that we view as a horrific failure of law enforcement, where there's something murky, something went wrong, victims haven't been accounted for in a fair way. I would think maybe there's a better model than just dumping it all out for everybody to go crazy. What about having, like, seriously professional law enforcement types? And I don't mean just on one side of the aisle, but like a bipartisan professional approach, a commission approach. And you basically say, we're going to lock these people in the skiff in kind of like a 9/11 commission way or a Kennedy assassination way. And I know there's room for criticism of all these commissions too. But I kind of like the thought of at least trying for some serious-minded adults to review these things and make findings and learn lessons from it, instead of just generally dumping everything into the stratosphere of X and having everybody scream about how they've proven their conspiracy now, or what did we not get when we got this big bill passed in 2025. Like, I don't know that this is ever going to silence voices in a prolonged way. You're going to have some people that latch on to an email here and there and try to pretend that it devastates President Trump. You're going to have people that are mostly interested in just prolonging the topic because they think it's a winning topic politically. But I don't know that we're going to learn any lessons in kind of the current state of affairs. And I've said this about, like, January 6th. I don't want a bunch of politicians, even with me in the Senate now, I don't want a bunch of politicians pretending that they're striving for objective truths and lessons. I would rather have some core of people that have longtime criminal justice experience, for instance, that would sit down and wade through all this and give a good faith effort, it's something we could actually learn from. That may be hopelessly naive at this point, but that's kind of where I come out. It's not that I think that there's necessarily a flaw with how they've anticipated certain issues and they've allowed the government to protect some identities. But I think the whole model is not a great model.
Well, you describe a world in which grown-up people are making grown-up decisions. I love that idea too. I don't know how likely it is to happen. When we get to that point, I'm going to nominate you as one of the serious people to put in the skip. Until then, we look forward to seeing you in your future Senate career. We want to thank you for coming in and sharing your wisdom with us today. We want to thank all of our listeners for joining us. We're here every week. If you like the show, please hit the subscribe button, and you can write to us at atkim@wsj.com.